In the early 1900s, something extraordinary was happening in Chicago that few people talk about today. A neighborhood called Bronzeville became one of the most powerful and wealthy black communities in all of American history. Picture this: black entrepreneurs, dreamers, and business pioneers were building something incredible right there on the south side of Chicago. They were creating banks, insurance companies, newspapers, and real estate empires worth millions and millions of dollars. These were not small businesses or family shops. These were major institutions that rivaled white-owned companies across America. One man named Anthony Overton became so successful that he built a massive business empire that included a cosmetics company, a publishing company, and a national bank called the Douglas National Bank. This bank became one of the largest black-owned banks in the entire country. The reason all this happened so fast was because of something called the Great Migration. Starting around 1915 and lasting until about 1930, more than 1 million African Americans left the South looking for better opportunities in northern cities. Chicago became one of the biggest destinations for these hopeful families and entrepreneurs. With them came workers, business owners, investors, and visionary thinkers who believed they could build something amazing. And for a short period in American history, they did exactly that. Wealth circulated inside the Bronzeville community in ways that made it almost self-sufficient. Black doctors treated black patients and got paid by black families. Black banks gave loans to black businesses to help them grow. Black newspapers told the stories of black people and black achievements. For a brief moment, Bronzeville looked like it could be a real blueprint for how black financial independence and economic power could actually work, even during a time when segregation was the law of the land. But hidden beneath all this prosperity and success, a dangerous financial trap was quietly forming. And almost nobody saw it coming until it was too late to stop it. The trap started with something that sounds simple at first, but it was anything but simple. It started with real estate and property. Because of segregation laws in Chicago, black families were legally and practically restricted to living in only very small neighborhoods and specific areas of the city. Banks and white lenders refused to give mortgages or financing to black families who wanted to buy homes outside of these confined areas. This created what you might call an economic pressure cooker. There were too many buyers all looking for homes, but there was too little available land where black families were allowed to buy. When demand is high and supply is low, prices go up. And prices went up dramatically in Bronzeville. But here is where the trap got really unfair and really dangerous. Traditional banks refused to give black families normal mortgages, the kind that white families could easily get. So instead, many black families had no choice but to go into something called contract buying. And contract buying was one of the most exploitative and cruel financial systems in the entire history of American housing. Here is how it worked, and it is important to understand this because it directly hurt millions of people. Imagine you want to buy a house, you find one you love, and you want to own it and live in it. But under contract buying, you do not actually own the house until you make the very last payment. You are paying month after month, year after year, but the seller still owns your house. This means if you miss even just one payment, even if you have paid for 5 years or 10 years, you lose the entire house, and the seller keeps the house. And the seller also keeps every single dollar you already paid them. You get nothing back. You have nothing to show for all your years of hard work and sacrifice. These contracts were also incredibly unfair with their prices. They would inflate the cost of homes by 200% or even more. A house that was actually worth $5,000 might be sold to a black family for $15,000 through a contract buying deal. Multiply this unfairness across thousands and thousands of families, and you start to understand how much wealth was being drained out of the black community in Chicago. This system of contract buying extracted wealth from Chicago's black families for decade after decade after decade. But the real and massive disaster did not come from contract buying alone. The real disaster arrived during something called the Great Depression, and that is when all the financial dominoes began to fall like a line of cards being knocked over one by one. In 1929, something catastrophic happened in America. The stock market crashed. This event became known as the Wall Street Crash of 1929, and it changed everything overnight. Banks across the entire country started collapsing and going out of business. Credit disappeared. Businesses everywhere started closing their doors. People lost their jobs and their savings. It was one of the worst financial disasters America had ever experienced. But black-owned banks in Chicago faced an even bigger and more serious problem than white-owned banks. They were completely cut off from the federal financial safety net that the government was creating to help American banks survive. When the U.S. government created new banking protections and support programs during the Great Depression, most black banks were excluded from these critical programs. They were excluded from access to capital. They were excluded from government help. They were pushed to the side. This meant that when panicked customers started withdrawing their money from black banks all at once, trying to save whatever they had left, the black banks had nowhere to turn. They had no backup. They had no safety net. They had no help from the government. One of the most devastating losses happened when a major black financial institution called the Binga State Bank collapsed in 1930. This bank was founded by a man named Jesse Binga, who was one of Chicago's most respected and successful black entrepreneurs. When this bank collapsed, thousands and thousands of depositors lost their entire savings overnight. Families lost their life savings. Business owners lost the money they had saved to keep their businesses running. Workers lost the money they had carefully saved for their families. Businesses that depended on getting loans from the bank suddenly had no way to get financing anymore. The entire network of black entrepreneurship in Chicago started collapsing, piece by piece, institution by institution. Businesses that had taken years to build closed down in weeks. Dreams that had seemed so solid and so possible just months before suddenly vanished. But the crisis did not stop there. The worst was not yet over. Because the next blow would come directly from the federal government itself. And this blow would reshape the entire American housing market for generations to come. In the 1930s, while the Great Depression was devastating the country, the government introduced new housing policies that were supposed to stabilize the economy and help people buy homes. These policies sounded good in theory, but these policies had a hidden and deeply unfair flaw that would hurt black Americans for decades and decades to come. The government decided to grade neighborhoods based on lending risk. Neighborhoods that the government decided were safe and good investments got marked in green on maps. Neighborhoods that the government decided were dangerous or risky got marked in red on maps. This policy became known as redlining, and it was one of the most systematically racist policies in American history, and many black neighborhoods, including large parts of Chicago and the once thriving Bronzeville area, were marked in red. The red marking meant that banks were officially discouraged from lending money in those neighborhoods. Banks would not give out mortgages in red neighborhoods. Banks would not refinance homes in red neighborhoods. Banks would not invest money in red neighborhoods. The entire financial system turned away from black neighborhoods. Homeowners in these neighborhoods were trapped. They could not sell their homes easily because banks would not finance buyers. They could not borrow money against their homes because banks would not lend in red areas. Property values stagnated and stopped growing. Buildings deteriorated and fell into disrepair because people could not afford to fix them. The entire neighborhood slowly weakened and declined. Meanwhile, white neighborhoods were receiving massive flows of credit and investment from banks and the government. Money poured into white neighborhoods. Homes in white neighborhoods went up in value. Property wealth grew and grew. But in black neighborhoods, it was the opposite. Wealth disappeared. Opportunity vanished. The result was a massive wealth gap created deliberately through housing policy. Black families who had built successful businesses and bought property during the early 1900s watched their financial progress stall and stop completely, or they watched it disappear entirely. And the once powerful economic engine of Bronzeville, which had been proof that black economic power could thrive even during segregation, slowly weakened and faded away. The community that had seemed so strong and so successful just decades before began to decline and lose its power. But the most shocking part of this entire story is what economists discovered decades and decades later, when they started studying this history and looking at the numbers and the data and the evidence. Because the wealth that was lost during this era did not just disappear into thin air. The wealth that was extracted from the black community through contract buying, through bank collapses, through redlining, and through systematic exclusion from the financial system did not vanish without consequences. Instead, it reshaped the financial future of entire generations of black families. It reshaped the economic possibilities for black Americans. It created a disadvantage that has lasted until today. Today, economists widely agree on one important fact. Housing and property ownership is one of the biggest and most important drivers of generational wealth in America. When your parents own a home, that home gains value over time. You inherit that home or the money from selling it. You use that wealth to buy your own home. Your children inherit that home. The wealth grows and grows across generations. This is how white American families built enormous wealth over the 20th century. But for many black families in cities like Chicago, access to that wealth-building opportunity was systematically and deliberately restricted. Redlining made it impossible for black families to buy homes in neighborhoods that were appreciating in value. Contract buying made it so that black families paid inflated prices for homes and often lost everything if they missed a payment. Bank collapses took away the institutions that provided capital to black businesses and entrepreneurs. Studies conducted by economists estimate that contract buying alone extracted hundreds of millions of dollars from black homeowners during the middle of the 20th century. Hundreds of millions of dollars. That money could have been used to start new businesses. That money could have funded education for children. That money could have created family wealth that would have lasted for generations. Instead, it flowed out of the black community. It went to white landlords and white speculators who got rich by exploiting black families. And the effects of this are still visible and measurable today. The racial wealth gap in America remains one of the largest economic divides in the country. Black families today have significantly less wealth than white families. The median white family has about 10 times more wealth than the median black family. This gap did not happen by accident. It was created by policy. It was created by banking systems. It was created by decisions made by governments and financial institutions. It was created by the same systems that extracted wealth from Bronzeville during the early 20th century. But historians also point out something important that deserves to be remembered and celebrated. Despite facing enormous and overwhelming financial barriers, despite being excluded from banks and mortgages and credit, despite living under segregation and facing discrimination at every turn, Chicago's black entrepreneurs built powerful and impressive economic institutions from almost nothing. They built banks. They built insurance companies. They built newspapers. They built real estate empires. They did this with courage and determination and vision. Their story is not just a story about loss and decline and defeat. Their story is also a story about resilience. It is a story about what black Americans could accomplish when they were given even some opportunity to try. And it raises an uncomfortable question that historians and economists still wrestle with today. If access to fair credit had existed in Bronzeville during the early 1900s, if black entrepreneurs had not been excluded from banking systems, if contract buying had been illegal, if redlining had never happened, if black banks had received the same government support as white banks during the Great Depression, how powerful could that economic community have become? How much wealth could black families have built? How many more businesses could have been created? How many more jobs could have been provided? How much more successful could black America have been? We will never know the answer to that question. But we can look at what was actually built in Bronzeville before the financial systems turned against it, and we can see the enormous potential that was lost. The rise and fall of Chicago's black elite is a story that is still being told and studied today. And it is important to understand that it was not just a story about racism, although racism was certainly part of it. It was fundamentally a story about money and banking and power. It was a story about how financial systems work and how they can be used to build up communities or tear them down. It was a story about the power of capital and credit. Because when access to capital is controlled and restricted, when credit is denied to some groups while being freely given to others, entire communities can rise and prosper, or entire communities can fall and decline. The choice is made by those who control the financial system. So here is the real question that we should be asking ourselves as we look at this history and think about our present day. Are today's financial systems any different? Have we fixed the problems that destroyed Bronzeville? Or are there still ways that money and banking and financial policy are used to create advantages for some groups while creating disadvantages for others? These are the questions that historians and economists and social scientists are still debating and studying today. The story of Chicago's black elite reminds us that history is not just about the past. It is about understanding how the past created the present and how the decisions we make today will shape the future. When we understand what happened in Bronzeville, we understand how the world we live in today was created. We understand that wealth gaps and opportunity gaps are not natural or inevitable. They are created by systems and policies and decisions. And if they were created by systems and policies and decisions, they can be changed by systems and policies and decisions. That is the final lesson of the story of Chicago's black elite. It is a story about loss, but it is also a story about possibility. It is a story about what was taken, but it is also a story about what could be rebuilt.